So I'm sure everyone knows about the Scream movies, especially if you are a millennial. The cheesy but also somewhat terrifying slasher movies that involves the crazed lunatic wearing a distorted ghost mask face that goes around hunting unsuspected teenagers. Most of us would just think, oh, this is just another teen slasher movie, until you find out that this is actually based on a true story that will make you double check all of your doors, windows, just to make sure everything is locked and safe before you go to bed at night. All right, so let's get this video started. Now, before we go into the story, hi, my name is Ashley, and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. So if that's your thing, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. It really does help me grow here on YouTube. I'm seeing a lot of subscribers coming over from TikTok as well. If you guys want more short story formats, head over there, same username at HeebieJeebiesTV. All right, enough rambling. Now let's get into today's story. All right, so this story takes us to sunny Gainesville, where we meet a handful of young college students. It was August 24th, 1990, and the semester was just about to begin at the University of Florida, where 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell were freshmen. They were both looking forward to a wonderful time in college, enjoying the sunshine, the parties, and essentially all of the college experiences that they're supposed to have. On the night of August 24th, both of the girls were fast asleep in their home, unaware that they were being watched. In the middle of the night, an unknown assailant quietly broke into their home and went straight for their bedrooms, where the attack began. Their mouths were immediately taped over and their hands were tied behind their backs. This wasn't a robbery, though. The assailant wanted much more than that. He then forced both of the women to perform oral on him before proceeding to assault them multiple times over. Once he was finished, he stabbed both of the women, taking their lives in what seemed like an instant. But he wasn't done. He wanted something to remember them by, a trophy, if you will. The assailant then went on to slice off a piece of both women's chest before disappearing into the darkness of the night. This attack marked the beginning of the serial killer spree known as the Gainesville Ripper. A few days went by before anyone noticed that the girls had passed away. It wasn't until their parents were unable to reach either of their daughters that they actually ended up going to their apartments and asked the maintenance worker to let them in. Initially, the maintenance worker was a little bit hesitant. He wasn't sure if he should let them in. He had never met these people before in his life, so he decided that he should call the police and allow them to do a welfare check. So they called the police, and a short while later, they arrived to the apartments. When police arrived, they entered the apartments, and as soon as they entered the bedroom of one of the girls, the main officer saw one of the girls posed sitting upright on the bed. He took one look at this very disturbing scene and walked right out with the maintenance guy right behind him, except the maintenance guy could not handle what he had just seen, and he was seen running out screaming, kind of freaking out the parents who had not yet seen what everyone else was freaking out about. The very next day, a young woman named Christina Hoyt, who was also 18 years old, met the same tragic fate as Sonia and Christina. The Gainesville Ripper broke into her home using the darkness of his night to hide his identity. He then proceeded to assault her again many times, cutting off a part of her chest and placed it beside her. But he was not finished with her just yet. And if you're squeamish, this is a trigger warning, so consider yourself warned. He then proceeded to cut off her head and then propped up her body on the corner of her bed, in order to make her sit up straight, which I'm not entirely sure how he was able to get her body to stay balanced upright without her head on. And then he proceeded to take her head that was now severed and placed it on a bookshelf nearby. Although Krista was not a student at the university, she did go to a local Santa Fe community college, and she also had a part-time at the local county sheriff's office. When she failed to show up for her night shift that evening, suspicions rose about her whereabouts. And to make matters worse, the police officers that ended up discovering her body were some of her colleagues and even her friends. Of course, by this point, the entire University of Florida had heard about what was going on. Women were especially terrified of going to bed, being alone, and this kind of just created a community chaos to the point where everyone was sleeping in groups together. The only similar experience that people could relate this to at the time was that of Ted Bundy, who had also gone on an insane killing spree in the 70s, taking the lives of multiple college girls at Florida State University. Essentially, everyone knew that there was a serial killer on the loose, and it could have been quite literally anyone. People had no idea if they were sitting right next to a serial killer in class or if it could have been their next door neighbor. On August 27th, the next attack took place. This time, the victims were 23-year-old Tracy Paules and 23-year-old Manuel Taboada. The Gainesville Ripper again broke into their home while they were both sleeping. He first went after Manuel, likely to get rid of the threat in their home before moving on to Tracy. Based on the autopsy, it was discovered that Manuel had put up a vicious fight against the attacker. He had several defensive wounds all over his arms and his hands. However, the only difference in this attack was that the Gainesville Ripper did not mutilate either one of the bodies, and this was believed because he was either short on time or there was a higher risk of him getting caught at this particular time. After all of these senseless attacks, the university was in complete chaos. People were terrified and classes had to be canceled for an entire week. Similar to what just happened in the Idaho 4 case in November of 2022, students left in droves for the safety of their hometowns. Those students who were either forced to stay or who could not actually leave carried baseball bats around with them for safety. Others installed multiple locks on their doors, while other groups of students slept in groups while taking shifts to make sure someone was always awake to keep a lookout. At one point, it was believed that there was no way that this work was done by one person alone. People started to believe that it must have been at least two, if not more, perpetrators. And it was estimated that by the end of August that year, 700 students had permanently left the campus, which I don't entirely blame them. I think this is something that most of us would do if there was a crazy serial killer on the loose and we had absolutely no idea who was responsible. So after all of this chaos, police had to take a step back to reevaluate what each of these crimes had in common, if there were any patterns that the Gainesville Ripper would continuously repeat. And coincidentally, they ended up being in luck. Not only would the Gainesville Ripper mutilate most of the bodies, he would also use tape to bound his victims, but when he was done, he always removed the tape and he always wiped down all of the bodies with a vinegar solution to get rid of any tape residue. Police believed this was done in order to reduce the chances of him leaving any DNA or fingerprints behind. He would also pose the victims, usually in a suggestive manner, which, if you know a little bit about true crime, is usually meant to humiliate the victims. And he would do this before fleeing the scene, which would end up leaving a very disturbing scenario for police to walk into. With all of this information, police started to look back and see if they could connect the dots to any other crimes in Florida or potentially even in any other states that could fit these similar patterns, and to their luck, it ended up working. Police recalled about another crime that had taken place just the year before in 1989 in a town called Shreveport in Louisiana. It had gone unsolved, and it happened to be a triple homicide where a man named Tom Grissom and his daughter Julie and his grandson Sean all had their lives taken away from them. However, what they were able to connect with all of these three bodies was that they had been posed, and there was also tape residue left behind, and they were able to detect that their bodies had also been wiped down with a vinegar solution. Thankfully, in this case, police had been able to get a sample of DNA and determine that the perpetrator had a type B blood. This was a huge revelation to police because they had also managed to retrieve a DNA sample from the Gainesville murders, which also happened to be a type B blood. So essentially, this meant that whoever had committed the triple homicide in Shreveport was also likely the same person committing the crimes in Gainesville. All they needed to do at this point was really just find out who this person was. Now, at the same time, in another part of Shreveport, there was a woman named Cindy Jurachich. Of course, she had heard about the horrifying events in Gainesville. She just did not understand who would want to do this to so many young and innocent students. It wasn't until she had a flashback moment where she recalled something that absolutely gave her the chills. She had met a man named Danny Rolling at a church in Shreveport. They developed a friendship over time, with Danny eventually coming over to Cindy's house often, where Cindy and her husband lived. There was one particular evening where the three of them were hanging out together at Cindy's home when Stephen, Cindy's husband, approached her in secret and told her that Danny had to go. Cindy was stunned. She didn't understand why her husband was saying this about Danny. And it wasn't until he explained what Danny had just told him in secret. Danny had confessed to Stephen that he had a small problem. Stephen thought that he meant he probably just had a weird habit, maybe a weird tic. He was not ready for what Stephen was about to tell him. Danny ends up replying, "I like to stick knives into people." Cindy had initially brushed off these comments, but it wasn't until a short time later that Danny had told her something else, and that's when she really connected the dots. He had told her that one day he was going to leave their hometown of Shreveport and go to a place where the girls are beautiful so that he could just lay in the sun and watch women all day long. Again, she was bothered by these comments. It kind of gave her the creeps. It kind of gave her, a really odd feeling towards Danny. But again, she didn't do anything with this information until the following year. In late 1990, Cindy picked up the phone and called Crime Stoppers, leading them straight to Danny Rolling, telling them that they needed to look into him as a potential suspect for the Gainesville murders. However, what Crime Stoppers and Cindy didn't know at the time was that Danny had already been arrested. On September 7th, 1990, there was a high-speed chase in Ocala, Florida, after cops had been called to a robbery at a local Winn-Dixie, which is a local supermarket chain. It was Danny, and thankfully police had caught up to him and ended up arresting him. Months after Danny had been arrested for the robbery, they were alerted about the tip Cindy had called in and reported it in January of 1991. It was then that police decided to take a DNA sample of Danny and compare it to the Shreveport homicides. And of course, it ended up being an identical match. Essentially, Danny Rolling had been identified as the Gainesville Ripper. Once Danny was presented with all of the overwhelming evidence, he quickly confessed. At the same time, police were also looking into other nearby crimes that had been committed and were able to determine that he had also been responsible for these. There had been multiple robberies at the same time as the Gainesville homicides, including bank and gas station robberies across several states, including Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. He had also broken into the home of another woman named Janet Frank on August 5th, 1990, where he had assaulted her, but for whatever reason, he did not choose to take her life. Police also discovered that Danny had been living in a makeshift campsite in a forest that was known to be close to a lot of student apartments. That's where they discovered the screwdriver that had been used to break into all of these people's homes, as well as multiple audio recordings of him alluding to these crimes. Of course, we all want to know why someone would do anything like this, and so police did ask him, and the answer Danny gave was absolutely shocking. He said he wanted to become a superstar like Ted Bundy, and that his personality was severely affected with these alter egos because he was a Gemini. Over time, various psychologists would go on to study Danny Rolling and determine that he was likely suffering from several mental illnesses, including border personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and paraphilia. After his arrest, people started looking into this guy's story. Why was he like this? What would make someone do something so horrifying like this? And to everyone's surprise, Danny had a very dark history that went all the way back to basically when he was born. So you see, Danny had a very toxic childhood. His mother was Claudia and his father was James Rolling. And although they were married, Danny's father, James, never wanted any children. He also happened to be a police officer who was known to severely abuse both his wife and Danny. Now, I'm not saying this to justify what Danny would end up doing in his adult years. This is just to give you guys a little bit of context. So it was also reported that Danny was severely abused from the beginning, from the age of just 1 year old, because his father had gotten so upset at him for not crawling properly. The following year, in 1955, when Danny's younger brother was born, the abuse was said to have only gotten even worse. All this abuse took a very severe toll on Danny, and by the time he was in elementary school, his school counselor had determined that he was suffering from an inferiority complex with aggressive tendencies and poor impulses. By the time he was 14, Danny also started showing some very disturbing behavior. He had actually been caught being a peeping Tom towards the daughter of one of his neighbors. And when his father found out about this, he was said to have given him the beating of a lifetime. I guess this had really kind of whipped Danny into some sort of shape, because after that incident, he was said to have really tried to control his impulses, and he even started attending church on a regular basis. And he continued to attend church regularly into his adult life, considering that's where he ended up meeting Cindy later on. Unfortunately, by the time he was an adult, he had fallen into severe substance abuse problems, using acid quite often. This didn't stop him though. Surprisingly, somehow he was able to get married when he was 19 years old. But just 4 years later, it was quite short-lived, and by the time he was 23 years old, his wife and daughter ended up leaving him because he had threatened to take the life of his own wife. Following that, Danny went on to assault another woman who was said to have resembled his ex-wife quite a lot in order for him to take out his deep-seated aggression and almost a way of taking revenge on his wife for leaving him. Throughout the rest of his adult life, Danny rarely had any sort of stability. He was never able to keep a job for long term. He was in and out of prison for petty thefts, and he also went back and forth from a variety of small towns back to Shreveport. It was almost as if whenever something would get too difficult, or whenever he would kind of give up in whatever adventure he was going on in a new place, he always went back home for safety and to kind of just restart before getting back on his feet and going to a new place to basically cause chaos. But this last incident seemed to have really set Danny off. It was May of 1990, just a few months before the Gainesville homicides started happening. Danny shot his own father not once but twice. Miraculously, his father did end up surviving, although he did lose an eye and a part of his ear. Danny then ended up fleeing Shreveport after he had broken into a home of a strange man, stole his identity, and then hopped on a bus and fled to Sarasota, Florida, where he attempted to start a new life as Michael Kennedy Jr. And that is where the Gainesville Ripper was born. In 1991, Danny was then charged with all of the 5 homicides having to do with Gainesville, and then in 1994, he was sentenced to death. And it wasn't until October 25th, 2006, where Danny was finally given the lethal injection, with dozens of witnesses watching the entire thing, including family members of all of his victims. When he was asked if he had any last words, he declined, but instead he started singing some gospel song, almost as if he were hoping for one last chance to be accepted into a higher place. Later on, Wes Craven would go on to do some research and hear about what happened in Gainesville, and he took all of that chaos and horror that happened in a small town and would later on turn it into his inspiration for the movies Scream. And that is the story of the Gainesville Ripper and how it inspired this crazy franchise that has blown up over the decades. But let me know what you guys think. And if you have any other video suggestions, let me know in the comments below. Again, if you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. I really do appreciate all of your support, and don't forget to check me out on TikTok. I post once or twice a day over there, a lot more content, and the link is in my description box. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next video.